It didn't fall the way you were taught. There was no single catastrophic moment, no dramatic last stand, no day the world went dark. The greatest empire in human history, an empire that bound 60 million people under one law, one currency, one idea of what civilization meant, dissolved slowly, quietly, in the way that truly terrifying things always do. Not with a roar, with a silence. And the question that should stop you cold, the question that cuts straight through 2,000 years of comfortable legend, is this: what if Rome's most lethal enemy never came from outside its walls? What if it was already inside? This is History Unlocked, and we exist precisely for this. Not to give you the version of history that makes you feel safe. Not to dress ancient tragedy in dramatic spectacle and call it education. We are here to confront what actually happened. To pull back the marble facade and show you the rot beneath. To tell you the truths that are inconvenient and complicated and impossible to look away from. If you believe that history deserves honesty rather than mythology, then stay with us. Subscribe, because what follows is not a story about barbarians and battles. It is a mirror, and what it reflects may be the most unsettling thing you encounter today. At the height of its power, Rome was not simply a nation or an empire in the conventional sense. It was an idea made physical. From the mist-soaked frontiers of Britannia to the sun-bleached deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic coast all the way to the borders of Mesopotamia, one authority bound together dozens of peoples, hundreds of languages, thousands of distinct cultures, beneath a single imperial structure of extraordinary sophistication. Roads stitched continents together with geometric precision. Aqueducts defied gravity and delivered 100 million gallons of clean water into the city of Rome every single day. Legions marched in disciplined formation beneath crimson banners that projected order into every corner of the known world. Roman law reached into regions that had never known centralized governance and gave them courts, contracts, and the concept of civic rights to its citizens, born in Britain or born in Syria. Speaking Celtic or speaking Aramaic, Rome felt permanent. It felt chosen. It felt like the natural condition of the world rather than a human construction that could be unmade. But permanence is almost always a carefully maintained illusion. And beneath the marble monuments and triumphal arches, something was already giving way. The first fracture was political, and it ran deeper than any battlefield wound. When Augustus transformed the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire in the decades following Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 B.C., he created an era of stability and prosperity that Romans would later remember as a golden age. He was brilliant, calculating, and ruthless in precisely the measure each situation required. But the system he built carried a fatal flaw at its very foundation. There was no legitimate, codified, institutionalized mechanism for choosing a successor. Power did not transfer through law or democratic process. It transferred through proximity to the emperor, through military loyalty, through assassination, through the cold and brutal mathematics of who controlled the Praetorian Guard on any given morning. Augustus built his authority around the idea of himself. And when he died, the question of who came next became the single most dangerous question in the known world. That question would be answered by murder more often than by any peaceful transition for the next 2 centuries. Emperors were killed by the very soldiers hired to protect them. Generals raised private armies and marched on Rome itself. A Senate that had long since surrendered its real authority was forced repeatedly to choose between legitimizing rebellion or being crushed beneath it. And between 235 and 284 AD, in the catastrophic period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome endured at least 26 emperors in just 50 years. Most of them died violently. The empire fractured into competing regional powers. The imperial throne ceased to be a symbol of continuity and became instead a prize in a lethal and endless contest. Consider what that means at the human scale. Leadership changes every few months. Rival armies march through your province. Taxation increases not to defend the frontier but to fund civil wars between Roman commanders. Your farm is destroyed not by foreign invaders but by legions loyal to competing emperors. Would you still believe in Rome's destiny under those conditions? Or would survival simply become your only priority? The economic consequences of that political chaos compounded with every passing year. Rome's prosperity had always depended on forward momentum, on expansion, on conquest, on the constant flow of new wealth and new slaves and new territory into the imperial system. But expansion has limits, and Rome's limits had been reached. Without continuous influxes of plunder and tribute, the financial pressure on the central government became crushing. Emperors debased the currency to stretch their resources, reducing the silver content of Roman coins from 90% down to as low as 2% over the course of the 3rd century. Inflation spiraled, trade confidence collapsed, farmers abandoned land they could no longer afford to work. The economic engine that had powered Rome's rise began losing pressure in ways the empire had no structural mechanism to address. Corruption deepened every wound. Provincial governors siphoned tax revenues into personal fortunes. Wealth concentrated among the senatorial elite on vast tax-exempt estates, while rural populations bore rising burdens with shrinking returns. The gap between what the state demanded and what the state actually provided continued to widen. And when citizens feel systematically exploited rather than genuinely protected, their loyalty doesn't disappear overnight, it simply migrates. It finds new homes, smaller, local, more immediate sources of protection and identity that feel real in ways that distant imperial authority no longer does. Military overextension intensified every pressure already building. Rome's borders spanned thousands of miles of contested frontier. Germanic tribes pressed continuously along the Rhine and Danube. Persian forces challenged Rome in the east with increasing confidence. Maintaining those defensive lines required expenditures the empire could no longer sustainably generate. Recruitment increasingly relied on non-Roman soldiers, Germanic federates who fought for land and payment rather than for Roman identity, men whose loyalty was professional and transactional rather than civic and emotional. The legions that had once embodied Roman civilization began to reflect its fragmentation instead. In 285 A.D., Emperor Diocletian responded to the crisis by dividing the empire into eastern and western halves, 2 emperors, 2 administrations, a rational attempt at efficiency across unmanageable scale. The intent was stabilization, but the outcome revealed an imbalance that could not be corrected administratively. The eastern half, centered on wealthier and more urbanized territories, began to thrive. The western half, rural and overstretched, struggled. When Constantine later established Constantinople as a new imperial capital in the east, the symbolic center of gravity shifted away from Rome in a way that no administrative decree could reverse. The city that had once been the heart of the world was no longer the center of the empire that bore its name. And here is the uncomfortable truth that stands at the very center of this story. The turning point that changes how everything before and after must be understood. The peoples pressing at Rome's borders were not, in most cases, attacking out of hatred. Many of them admired Rome. Many had served in Roman armies, learned Roman tactics, worn Roman armor, sworn oaths to Roman emperors. The Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals. These peoples were not trying to destroy the civilization they had watched from the outside for generations. Many of them were fleeing something far worse. In the 370s A.D., the Huns swept westward from the Central Asian steppe with a speed and ferocity that shocked even the hardened frontier peoples of Europe, driving entire nations before them like water before a breaking dam. In 376 A.D., a massive wave of Visigoths arrived at the Danube River, Rome's northeastern frontier, and begged to be admitted, not as invaders, as refugees. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, entire communities carrying everything they owned, desperate for the protection of Roman civilization rather than seeking to overthrow it. The Emperor Valens permitted their crossing. And in that decision, whether you read it as genuine compassion or catastrophic miscalculation, lay the seeds of one of the most consequential disasters in Roman history. The Roman officials assigned to process and settle the Visigoths were corrupt. They exploited the refugees systematically, extorting them for basic necessities, selling them rotten food at criminal prices, enslaving their children in violation of the terms under which they had been admitted. The Visigoths, desperate, humiliated, starving inside the borders of the empire they had begged to join, did what any human beings do when the system that promised them protection begins consuming them instead. They rose. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths didn't merely defeat a Roman army, they killed the emperor himself. Valens died on that field while 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army was destroyed around him. And for the first time in living memory, Rome had been forced to confront something it had always refused to believe, that it was not invincible, that the psychological armor of eternal Rome could be pierced. that the gap between what the empire claimed to be and what it had actually become was now wide enough for catastrophe to walk straight through. This is precisely why History Unlocked exists. Not to sensationalize defeat, not to turn ancient tragedy into entertainment, but to show you the mechanisms, the real, human, institutional mechanisms through which great things are undone. Because the story of Adrianople is not a story about Roman weakness against barbarian strength. It is a story about what happens when bureaucratic corruption is normalized until it becomes catastrophic. Those Visigoths who killed Roman soldiers on that field had in many cases been Roman soldiers themselves. They knew Roman tactics from the inside because Rome had trained them. They turned that knowledge against the empire because the empire's own officials had enslaved their children. Rome created the threat that defeated it by failing the people who came to it in trust. If you believe that history deserves to be understood at that level of honesty, subscribe to History Unlocked, because this is what we do. And we never stop. The sack of Rome in 410 AD by Alaric's Visigoths lasted 3 days. The city that had not been touched by a foreign enemy in 8 centuries was looted. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, recorded that when he received the news he could not speak. He sat in silence because the unthinkable had become real. And yet the Western Empire endured for 66 more years after that moment, because collapse is almost never instantaneous. It is cumulative. It is the slow arithmetic of compounding failures that eventually exceeds any system's capacity to absorb them. The senatorial class continued to accumulate wealth on vast tax-exempt estates while the middle classes dissolved. Small landowners who could no longer pay their taxes or defend their properties surrendered them to powerful patrons in exchange for protection, entering a system of personal dependency that looked less and less like Roman citizenship and more like the feudalism that would define the medieval world that followed. Ordinary Romans stopped looking to Rome for protection because Rome had become the thing they needed protection from. They turned to local strongmen, to Germanic warlords, to anyone who could offer genuine security in exchange for loyalty. And in doing so, they were not betraying Rome. They were surviving. They were making the most rational decisions available to them inside a system that had become structurally irrational. By the early 5th century, the emperors of the Western Empire had relocated from Rome to Ravenna, a city surrounded by marshes on the Adriatic coast, chosen for its defensibility rather than its symbolic weight. An empire that rules from a swamp is no longer projecting power outward. It is hiding, and the leadership vacancy at the top was staggering. When Alaric sacked Rome in 410, Emperor Honorius, reportedly upon being informed that Rome had perished, is said to have panicked in concern for his pet rooster, which was also named Rome, and relaxed considerably upon learning that it was merely the city. Whether or not that account is historically precise in every detail, it captures something essential and devastating about the Western Empire's final leadership, profoundly, cosmically disconnected from the reality of what was happening to the world beyond their comfortable exile. In 476 A.D., the last act arrived without the drama it deserved. A Germanic military commander named Odoacer deposed the final Western Roman emperor, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus, carrying the names of both Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor. As if history were delivering one final bitter irony, there was no great siege, no final heroic charge, no last defiant stand beneath the eagles. Odoacer sent the boy into comfortable exile at a seaside villa and dispatched a letter to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople informing him that the Western Empire no longer required its own emperor. Constantinople barely flinched, because by then the Western Empire was a shell, its borders held by federates with transactional loyalty, its tax base beyond recovery, its administrative structures existing in name only. A ghost of governance haunting the ruins of what had once been the most powerful political entity the world had ever seen. It ended with a letter, not a battle. A letter! And here is the revelation that should permanently alter the way you understand this story. Rome never truly died. Not in the way the tidy date of 476 AD implies. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, continued for nearly 1,000 more years until its fall in 1453. Roman law became the foundation of every major Western legal system and remains embedded in the legal architecture of the modern world. The Catholic Church preserved Roman administrative structures, the Latin language, and Roman institutional habits through the medieval centuries and carried them forward into modernity. The very concept of Europe, of diverse peoples bound by shared law, shared institutions, and shared civilizational identity, is a Roman idea. We are still arguing about how to make it work, which means the question of why Rome fell is in some ways the wrong question entirely. The more honest question, the more urgent question, is why we keep trying to rebuild it. Because the dark truth at the center of all of this, the truth the fall of Rome demands we confront, is that it was never really about the barbarians at the gates. It was always about what happened inside the gates first. Political systems that prioritized personal power over institutional legitimacy. Economies that allowed wealth to concentrate until the foundation beneath them crumbled. Bureaucracies so corrupt that they converted the people they were meant to serve into enemies. Leaders who governed in comfort and isolation while the margins of their world collapsed. The always fatal, always widening gap between what a civilization says it stands for and what it actually does when tested. Rome did not fall because it was defeated by a superior force. Rome fell because it forgot what it was for. Forgot the compact between power and the people that power is supposed to serve. The most haunting dimension of all of this, the part that makes Rome not a safely distant lesson but a mirror aimed at the present with uncomfortable precision, is that many Romans knew. They saw it clearly. Historians and philosophers and generals and senators wrote about it with devastating accuracy. They named the problems. They proposed solutions. They documented the trajectory of decline with a clarity that has survived 2,000 years. They saw it coming and they said so. And the empire fell anyway. So sit with that for a moment, because the question Rome's long and luminous and ultimately tragic story leaves behind is not really about Rome at all. It is about the distance between knowledge and action, between seeing clearly and responding in time, between a civilization's stated values and its actual behavior when the cost of living up to those values becomes inconvenient. What does it actually take for a civilization to hear its own warnings? If this story changed something in the way you see history, if it made Rome feel less like an ancient curiosity and more like a living question, share it. Tell us what you believe Rome's greatest mistake truly was. The answers are never simple, and the conversation is always worth having. This is History Unlocked, where we confront the past without illusion, without comfort, and without apology. Because the ruins of Rome are still speaking. The only question is whether we are willing to listen.